What if the person everyone wanted was secretly waiting for the only man who wanted nothing from her? The rain had started just before sunset, turning the sidewalks of downtown Chicago into ribbons of shimmering light beneath the glow of old street lamps. Cars rolled past in quiet streams, their tires whispering across the wet pavement, while the scent of fresh rain and roasted coffee drifted through the evening air. Ethan Brooks adjusted the collar of his worn brown jacket as he carried a handcrafted walnut keepsake box toward the entrance of Hawthorne House, one of the city's most elegant restaurants. The box was a custom order for a retiring couple celebrating 40 years of marriage. It had taken him 3 weekends and every spare evening after work to finish it. He smiled quietly to himself. Honest work always felt heavier in the hands, but lighter in the heart. Inside, soft piano music floated through the dining room. Crystal glasses reflected golden light. Gentle conversations mixed with the distant clink of silverware, creating the kind of warmth money could imitate, but never truly buy. Ethan approached the hostess, delivered the package, signed the receipt, and politely declined the generous tip that was offered for bringing it after business hours. "You earned it," the hostess insisted. Ethan simply smiled. The payment was already fair. As he turned to leave, a quiet sound stopped him. Not loud, not dramatic, just one broken breath that somehow carried more pain than tears. Near the tall windows, overlooking the rain, sat a woman alone. Her elegant navy dress suggested wealth. The untouched candle between 2 dinner plates suggested disappointment. Across from her, an empty chair remained pulled back as though someone had stood up and never returned. She lowered her head into trembling hands. No one around her moved. Some glanced for a second before returning to their expensive conversations. Ethan hesitated. He had learned long ago that not every silence wanted company, but some did. He walked slowly toward her table and stopped a respectful distance away. "Ma'am," he said gently, "would you like me to ask someone to bring you a cup of coffee?" The woman looked up. Her blue eyes were bright with tears, yet she managed the faintest smile. "Do I really look that obvious?" Ethan shrugged softly, only to someone who has tried very hard not to cry before. The answer caught her completely off guard. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, as though she had forgotten what kindness sounded like. "He left," she whispered, 5 minutes after sitting down. Ethan nodded once. He did not ask why. He did not ask her name. He did not ask what had happened. Instead, he quietly pulled out the empty chair. "Would it bother you if a stranger sat here for 5 minutes? No advice. No questions. Just so you don't have to finish dinner looking at an empty seat." The woman blinked rapidly, surprised by an offer that carried no expectation. "Most people would ask why I'm first," she said. Ethan smiled with the calm confidence of a man who had spent years raising a little girl to judge hearts instead of titles. "I think knowing why someone hurts matters more than knowing their last name." Something inside her seemed to crack, not from weakness, but from relief. She exhaled slowly, as if she had been carrying the weight of an invisible world for far too long. "Then let me tell you something," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the piano. "Everyone says they want a woman like me. Tonight, I learned they only wanted everything around me." Ethan listened without interrupting. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, neither of them realized that this quiet conversation had already begun, changing 2 lives forever. Victoria lowered her eyes toward the untouched dinner that had long since grown cold. The candle between them flickered gently each time the restaurant door opened, and the soft melody of the piano seemed to wrap around the silence instead of breaking it. For the first time in years, she sat across from someone who had not reached for his phone, searched her face with ambition, or measured her worth by the labels attached to her life. Ethan rested his weathered hands on the edge of the table, but never crossed into her space. He understood that respect often sounded like quiet. A waiter approached, cautiously, unsure whether to interrupt. Victoria looked up with a tired smile. "Would you mind bringing another cup of coffee?" she asked. The waiter nodded. "Of course, ma'am." Ethan immediately reached for his wallet. "Please let me pay for mine." Victoria looked almost offended. "You sat down because I was crying. I think I can afford 2 cups of coffee." Ethan smiled politely. Maybe you can, but I can afford my own. For a brief second, she simply stared at him, then laughed softly through the last of her tears. It was not the polished laugh she offered investors or reporters. It sounded lighter, almost forgotten. You really are different, she whispered. Ethan shrugged. My daughter says everybody should carry their own backpack if they are able. Victoria tilted her head with curiosity. You have a daughter? His eyes softened immediately. Emily. She's 8 years old. She believes pancakes taste better when they're shaped like stars. Every stray dog deserves a second chance, and every rainy day is secretly a good day because flowers need rain too. Victoria smiled without realizing it. She sounds remarkable. She teaches me more than I teach her, Ethan answered. Children usually do. Their coffee arrived. Steam curled upward, carrying the rich aroma through the warm dining room. Outside, rain continued, tracing silver lines across the tall windows while traffic lights reflected like scattered jewels on the soaked streets below. Victoria wrapped both hands around the cup, as though searching for warmth deeper than the porcelain could offer. Can I ask you something? She said quietly. Ethan nodded. Why did you stop? He looked confused. When you heard me crying. Most people looked away. Some pretended not to notice. You walked over. Ethan took a slow breath before answering. Because years ago my wife used to tell me something. She said people rarely remember the biggest success of their day, but they never forget the stranger who showed kindness during the hardest 5 minutes of their life. Victoria lowered her eyes again. Your wife sounds wise. Ethan smiled gently, but sadness briefly crossed his face like a cloud passing over morning. Sunlight. She was. Victoria noticed the wedding band still resting on a chain beneath his shirt instead of on his finger. She did not ask about it. Some stories deserve permission before they were spoken. Instead, she offered her own. The man who left tonight said I intimidated him. He said my career would always matter more than any relationship. Then he thanked me for dinner and walked away before dessert arrived. Ethan remained silent for several moments. Finally, he spoke in the same calm voice that never demanded attention. Sometimes people do not leave because someone is too successful. Sometimes they leave because they are afraid they will never become comfortable with someone else's light. Victoria looked at him in complete surprise. Nobody had ever explained her pain without making her feel responsible for it. At that moment, she realized something that money had never been able to purchase. Across the table sat the first stranger in many years who listened without calculating what he might gain in return. The rain eased into a gentle mist, leaving tiny droplets clinging to the restaurant windows like scattered diamonds catching the glow of the city lights. The dinner crowd had begun to thin, and the quiet conversations around them faded into the comforting rhythm of glasses clinking and soft piano melodies drifting through the room. Ethan glanced at the old watch on his wrist and smiled apologetically. I should probably head home soon. My neighbor is watching Emily tonight, and she always insists on staying awake until I come through the front door. Victoria nodded with understanding. Yet for reasons she could not explain, she found herself hoping the evening would not end quite so quickly. She must love you very much, she said. Ethan's eyes warmed with quiet gratitude. She reminds me every day what really matters. Before either of them spoke again, the front door opened, letting in a cool breeze carrying the fresh scent of rain. A small voice called across the dining room. Daddy. Ethan immediately stood and turned. A little girl wearing a yellow raincoat hurried toward him, carefully avoiding the busy servers while holding a small blue umbrella almost as tall as she was. Behind her walked Mrs. Evelyn Parker, the kind retired schoolteacher who lived next door and often helped watch Emily whenever Ethan worked late. I hope you do not mind, Mrs. Parker said with an apologetic smile. Emily kept asking if we could come make sure you remembered to eat dinner yourself. Ethan laughed softly and knelt to embrace his daughter. I think I forgot again. Emily stepped back and looked up at him with playful seriousness. I knew it. You always tell me people cannot help others if they forget to take care of themselves. Victoria watched the exchange in complete silence. The words were simple, but the love behind them filled the space around the table more completely than any expensive decoration ever could. Emily finally noticed Victoria sitting beside her father. Instead of looking surprised by her elegant clothes or graceful appearance, she offered the woman a bright smile. "Hello." Victoria smiled back. "Hello there." Emily tilted her head with the innocent curiosity only children possess. "Are you feeling better now?" Victoria blinked in surprise. "What makes you think I was not feeling well?" Emily pointed gently toward the folded napkin beside Victoria's untouched dessert plate. "Daddy says people sometimes cry because their hearts get tired before their bodies do." For a brief moment, Victoria could not answer. No board meeting had ever left her speechless. No interview had ever stolen her words. Yet one little girl had quietly seen through every wall she had spent years building. Emily reached into the pocket of her raincoat and carefully placed a tiny folded paper star on the table. It had clearly been made by hand from notebook paper colored with bright crayons. "Whenever I get scared at school," she explained, "Daddy tells me to keep one of these in my pocket because even when it rains, stars are still there. We just cannot see them for a little while." Victoria looked at the small paper star resting beside her coffee cup. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. It was worth almost nothing. It felt more valuable than every luxury gift she had received during the past decade. Mrs. Parker quietly excused herself to wait near the entrance, giving the little family a few extra moments together. Ethan smiled with gentle embarrassment. "Emily likes fixing broken days." Emily looked at Victoria once more before slipping her small hand into her father's. "I think tomorrow will be kinder to you," she said with complete confidence. Victoria felt warmth return to her smile for the first time in longer than she could remember. As Ethan prepared to leave, she realized that neither he nor his daughter had asked what she did for a living, how much money she had, or why strangers filled magazines with stories about her. To them, she had simply been a woman whose heart had grown tired, and somehow that simple kindness felt like the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale autumn sunlight that spilled between the glass towers of downtown Chicago, washing the streets in soft gold after the night's gentle rain. Ethan Brooks parked his aging pickup beside Sterling Tower just before 8 o'clock. The truck had more than 200,000 miles on it, and the faded blue paint carried years of honest work across its surface. He stepped out wearing clean jeans, a pressed flannel shirt beneath his work jacket, and work boots polished as carefully as he polished every promise he made. Restoring old woodwork had become his specialty, and the maintenance company that occasionally hired him had requested help repairing several handcrafted walnut panels inside the executive conference floor. Ethan gathered his toolbox, nodded politely to the security guard, and entered the bright marble lobby. The building hummed with quiet efficiency. Elevators glided silently. Fresh flowers filled the air with a subtle fragrance. Employees carrying coffee and laptops crossed the polished floor with practiced purpose. Ethan followed the maintenance supervisor toward the executive level without paying much attention to the company name displayed throughout the building. His mind was already measuring wood grain, matching finishes, and planning careful repairs. They reached the 38th floor just as several assistants hurried into position outside a large conference room. The atmosphere changed almost instantly. Conversations stopped. Phones lowered. Dozens of employees straightened their jackets as if responding to an invisible signal. Ethan glanced around with quiet curiosity. "Important meeting?" he asked. The supervisor smiled nervously. "The chief executive officer is arriving." Before Ethan could answer, the private elevator doors opened with a soft chime. A woman stepped forward, surrounded only by calm confidence instead of loud authority. She wore a tailored cream suit, carried a simple leather portfolio, and acknowledged every employee with a gracious nod instead of expecting applause. Ethan froze. It was the same woman who had quietly held a paper star in trembling hands less than 12 hours earlier. Victoria looked ahead at first, speaking briefly with her assistant about the morning schedule. Then her eyes found Ethan standing beside his toolbox. For the smallest moment, time seemed to pause. Surprise crossed her face before settling into the gentle smile he already recognized. Around them, Several executives exchanged puzzled glances. They had never seen their reserved chief executive officer smile at an unfamiliar contractor. Victoria walked directly toward him while the hallway remained completely silent. "Good morning, Ethan," she said warmly. He blinked twice before finding his voice. "You work here?" One of the senior executives nearly dropped the folder in his hands. Victoria laughed softly, the sound lighter than anyone in the hallway had ever heard. Something like that. Ethan looked from her to the polished bronze company logo on the wall behind her. Sterling Capital Group. His eyes widened with quiet understanding. "You are the chief executive officer." She nodded once. "I was hoping you would find out a little later." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, embarrassed that he had unknowingly spoken so casually with one of the most respected business leaders in the country. "I am sorry if I said anything inappropriate last night." Victoria gently shook her head. "Ethan, last night was the first evening in years that nobody cared about my title." Her voice became softer. "Please do not let today change that." She turned toward the executives whose expressions remained frozen in astonishment. "Mr. Brooks is here to restore the original walnut craftsmanship in our executive conference room. He deserves the same respect we offer every professional who walks through these doors." Without waiting for anyone to respond, she looked back at Ethan with quiet sincerity. "And one more thing. I would appreciate it if what happened last night remained between us." Ethan nodded without hesitation. Some conversations belong to the people who shared them. Victoria smiled again, holding the small folded paper star inside her portfolio where no one else could see it, already knowing that the simplest promise she had heard in years came not from a billionaire boardroom, but from an ordinary father whose character could never be measured by the clothes he wore or the truck he drove. The scent of freshly polished walnut filled the executive conference room as Ethan carefully ran his fingertips across the restored panels, feeling every grain before applying the final coat of protective oil. Morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting against the Chicago River far below, while the quiet hum of distant conversations drifted through the hallways outside. He had always believed Wood remembered every careful hand that touched it, and he treated each piece with the same patience he brought home to his daughter every evening. Just before noon, the conference room door opened quietly. Ethan expected another maintenance supervisor. Instead, Victoria stepped inside, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. She had exchanged her cream jacket for a charcoal blazer after the morning board meeting, yet there was something noticeably softer in her expression than the composed executive everyone else knew. "I hope you do not mind the interruption," she said with a gentle smile. Ethan stood and wiped his hands on a clean cloth. "Not at all." She placed 1 cup beside his toolbox. "Black coffee. No sugar. You mentioned last night that sweet coffee makes you miss the taste of good beans." Ethan looked surprised. "You remembered that?" Victoria laughed quietly. People remember more when they're truly listening. Before Ethan could answer, footsteps echoed from the hallway. 2 vice presidents slowed as they passed the open doorway. Their conversation stopped the moment they noticed the chief executive officer standing beside the contractor. They exchanged uncertain glances before continuing down the hall. Neither of them spoke, but curiosity traveled faster than words inside a corporate building. By early afternoon, whispers floated through every executive office. Some employees believed Ethan had been hired for a confidential project. Others wondered whether he was an old family friend. A few quietly guessed something much more personal. Ethan remained completely unaware. His attention stayed on matching with stain, tightening loose joints, and making sure every repaired panel looked exactly as it had decades earlier. Victoria, however, noticed every curious glance. During the afternoon leadership meeting, several board members seemed unusually distracted. One director finally cleared his throat. "Victoria, we have noticed you spending an unexpected amount of time with the restoration contractor." The room fell silent. Victoria closed the folder in front of her and answered without hesitation. "Because he is restoring craftsmanship that deserves respect." Another executive smiled politely, but continued. "People may misunderstand. Victoria looked calmly around the polished conference table. People often misunderstand kindness because they rarely see it without an agenda. No one replied. Her words settled across the room with the quiet certainty of truth. Meanwhile, Ethan packed away his tools as the workday ended. Before leaving, he placed the remaining wood finish back into its case and looked one final time at the restored walls. They no longer looked repaired. They simply looked whole again. As he walked through the lobby, his phone rang. Emily's cheerful voice filled the speaker. "Daddy, Mrs. Parker let me make spaghetti tonight. I only dropped one noodle." Ethan laughed warmly. "Only one? That is a new family record." Victoria happened to be crossing the lobby after another meeting. When she heard him speaking, she paused without interrupting. The smile in his voice carried a peace she had not heard inside Sterling Tower in years. Ethan noticed her and offered a friendly wave before stepping outside into the cool autumn air. There was no attempt to impress her, no effort to remain longer than necessary, and no expectation of another conversation. He simply climbed into his old pickup truck and drove home to his daughter. Victoria stood behind the tall glass entrance, watching the truck disappear into evening traffic. Around her stood a building worth billions of dollars. Yet the only thing occupying her thoughts was the quiet man who never once treated her like the most powerful person in the room, only like the woman who had needed someone to sit across from an empty chair. 3 days passed with the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. Yet something had begun to change beneath the polished surface of Sterling Tower. The restored walnut panels became the least discussed accomplishment on the executive floor. Instead, people quietly wondered why their chief executive officer had personally thanked a contractor twice in 1 week. Ethan remained completely unaware of the growing speculation. Every morning he packed Emily's lunch, walked her to school beneath the crisp October sky, and spent his days restoring old homes, repairing staircases, and bringing forgotten craftsmanship back to life. His world still measured success in honest work, bedtime stories, and whether his daughter smiled before falling asleep. Victoria's world measured everything differently. Board meetings filled her calendar from sunrise until evening. Financial reports covered her desk. Investors expected certainty. Directors expected obedience. Yet every quiet moment between meetings found her touching the small folded paper star resting inside the top drawer of her desk. One afternoon, after another exhausting strategy session, she looked through the window of her office at the endless skyline stretching across Chicago. The city appeared powerful from 38 floors above the streets, but power had never felt so lonely. Her assistant stepped inside carefully. "You're 4. A clock appointment has arrived." Victoria closed the drawer. "Please send him in." Ethan entered carrying a small wooden frame he had refinished after discovering it had been overlooked during the previous project. "I thought this belonged with the rest of the conference room," he explained. "It deserved to be finished properly." Victoria accepted it with genuine appreciation. Most people would never have noticed. Ethan smiled softly. The smallest pieces often complete the whole picture. Silence settled comfortably between them. Outside the office windows, clouds drifted slowly across the afternoon sun, while distant traffic moved like quiet ribbons beneath the towering buildings. Victoria finally gathered the courage she had been searching for since the night they first met. "Would you have a few minutes after work?" she asked. Ethan looked at the clock. "Emily is spending the evening with Mrs. Parker for her weekly baking lesson. I have some time." Victoria nodded. "There is something I should have told you before." An hour later, they sat on a quiet bench overlooking the Chicago River. The autumn breeze carried the scent of falling leaves and fresh water, while tour boats drifted peacefully beneath the bridges. There were no executives, no photographers, no assistants. Only 2 people watching the sunlight fade across the water. Victoria folded her hands together, searching for words that had remained trapped inside her for years. "The man who left during that dinner was not simply a blind date," she said quietly. "My board arranged the introduction." Ethan turned toward her without interrupting. "Several of our largest investors believe the company needs a picture-perfect family story. They think marriage would make me appear more stable to the market." She laughed softly, but there was no joy in the sound. Imagine building a company worth billions of dollars and still having strangers decide what your personal life should look like. Ethan remained silent, allowing her words room to breathe. She looked down at the paper star she had carried in her coat pocket ever since that rainy evening. When he walked away, he did not say, "I was unkind." He did not say, "I was difficult." He said he could never compete with my company because I would always choose the business first. Her voice grew quieter. The truth is that I have spent years choosing the business because everyone expected me to, and somewhere along the way I forgot how to choose myself. Ethan looked across the river before answering. Sometimes the strongest people become prisoners of responsibilities they never asked to carry. Victoria slowly lifted her eyes. "Do you know what hurt the most?" He gently shook his head. She smiled sadly. "Not one person asked whether I was happy. Until you did without ever speaking the question." The river carried the last reflections of sunset long after their conversation ended, but Ethan's thoughts remained with Victoria during the drive home. The city lights blurred softly through his windshield while the old pickup moved steadily toward the quiet neighborhood, where Emily waited with Mrs. Parker. He had spent years believing that wealth solved most problems. Now he understood that some burdens only grew heavier the higher a person climbed. The following morning, life returned to its familiar rhythm. Emily skipped beside him on the sidewalk toward school, her backpack bouncing gently against her shoulders. She looked up with a thoughtful smile. "Daddy, remember the lady from the restaurant?" Ethan nodded. "Edo." Emily held the straps of her backpack a little tighter. "I prayed she would wake up smiling today." Ethan smiled warmly. "I hope she did too." Across the city, Victoria stood before another executive meeting. The polished conference table reflected the morning sunlight, while charts and financial reports covered every screen. The directors praised quarterly growth, discussed acquisitions, and debated expansion plans. Yet before the meeting ended, one board member calmly folded his hands together. "There is another matter," he said. Several eyes turned toward Victoria. "People have noticed your recent conversations with the restoration contractor." The room became unusually quiet. Another director spoke carefully. "We are responsible for protecting the public image of this company. Rumors can influence investors." Victoria remained perfectly composed. "Rumors usually grow where truth is ignored." A third executive leaned forward. "If there is a personal relationship developing, the board should be informed before speculation affects the market." Victoria looked around the table without raising her voice. "The only relationship you need to know about is that I respect a man who completed his work with excellence." No one answered immediately. The silence carried more weight than another hour of debate. Meanwhile, Ethan received an unexpected phone call from the maintenance company that afternoon. Sterling Capital has requested additional restoration work at one of their historic properties, the supervisor explained. The project pays well and could last several weeks. Ethan remained quiet for a moment before responding. "I appreciate the offer, but I think it would be better if you assigned someone else." The supervisor sounded surprised. "You are turning down one of our biggest contracts." Ethan looked across his small workshop where framed family photographs rested beside woodworking tools worn smooth by years of honest labor. Sometimes protecting someone's peace is worth more than another paycheck. After ending the call, he returned to sanding a maple rocking chair that belonged to an elderly widow. Every careful movement carried the same quiet dignity as before, yet his heart felt heavier than the wood beneath his hands. Late that afternoon, Victoria received the news that Ethan had declined the project. She stood silently beside the window of her office while downtown traffic flowed below like rivers of light. Without hesitation, she picked up her coat and drove to the small workshop listed on the original contract. She found Ethan carefully brushing away sawdust as golden sunlight filtered through the open garage door. The air smelled of fresh cedar, warm coffee, and autumn leaves drifting across the sidewalk. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked softly. Ethan laid the sanding block on the workbench before meeting her eyes. "No." "Then why walk away?" she asked. His answer came quietly, but every word carried the weight of conviction. "Because you're..." Kindness already has people questioning your character, and I will never allow my presence to become another burden you have to defend. Victoria looked at him without speaking. For the first time in many years, she understood what real sacrifice looked like. It was not giving away money. It was quietly stepping back from someone you cared about simply to protect their dignity. Victoria remained standing in the doorway of Ethan's workshop long after his words settled into the quiet afternoon air. Outside, a cool October breeze stirred the golden leaves lining the sidewalk, while somewhere in the distance a train horn echoed across the city. The scent of fresh cedar surrounded them, warm and familiar, carrying the kind of peace that could never be purchased inside a glass tower. Ethan returned to the rocking chair resting on his workbench, gently brushing away another layer of fine sawdust. He did not look away because he was avoiding her. He looked away because respect sometimes meant allowing another person the space to think. Victoria finally stepped closer. "You believe walking away is protecting me," she said softly. "But you never asked whether that is what I wanted." Ethan rested both hands on the smooth wooden armrest before answering. "When people begin questioning your integrity because of me, I cannot pretend it does not matter." Victoria shook her head slowly. "They questioned my integrity long before I met you. They simply found a different reason." Silence settled between them once again. It was not uncomfortable. It felt like two honest hearts searching for the right words instead of the easiest ones. Just then a small voice floated across the workshop from the open front door. "Daddy, I made cinnamon cookies." Emily hurried inside, carrying a covered baking tray, almost too large for her small hands. Mrs. Parker followed behind her with a gentle smile. Emily stopped the moment she noticed Victoria. Her face immediately brightened. "You found your smile." Victoria laughed softly. "Did I?" Emily nodded with complete certainty. "It is not hiding anymore." Without another thought, Emily walked over and offered the tray. "Mrs. Parker says cookies are better when nobody eats them alone." Victoria accepted one with grateful hands. It was slightly uneven, shaped more by enthusiasm than perfection. She took a small bite and smiled. "This might be the best cookie I've had in years." Emily grinned proudly. "That is because I put extra cinnamon in it. Daddy says ordinary things become special when someone makes them with love." Victoria glanced toward Ethan. He looked slightly embarrassed, but he smiled anyway. Mrs. Parker quietly led Emily toward the small office in the back of the workshop to wash flour from her hands, leaving the two adults alone once more. Victoria held the paper napkin carefully between her fingers before speaking again. "Tomorrow morning our board will vote on a merger worth several $billion. They believe it is the most important decision of my career." Ethan listened quietly. She looked directly into his eyes. "Do you know what I realized after meeting you and Emily?" He gently shook his head. "Success means very little if every important decision moves you farther away from the life you actually want." Ethan took a slow breath. "Only you can decide what that life looks like." Victoria smiled with quiet gratitude. "That is exactly what I intend to do." The next morning, the executive board gathered beneath bright lights and polished glass. Financial projections filled enormous screens. Every director expected another predictable vote. Instead, Victoria calmly stood before them and closed the presentation without opening a single chart. "Before we discuss profits," she said, "I have reached a personal decision." Curious faces turned toward her. "I will not enter any relationship for appearances, negotiations, or shareholder confidence. My personal life will no longer be managed as a corporate strategy." A heavy silence filled the room. Several directors exchanged uneasy glances. One investor slowly removed his glasses in disbelief. Victoria remained completely calm. For the first time in years, she did not feel trapped by expectations. She felt free, and somewhere across the city, without knowing anything about the meeting that had just changed the course of a billion-dollar company. Ethan was helping Emily carve a small wooden star, believing that sometimes the greatest victories arrived without applause, quietly protecting the dignity of everyone they touched. 1 year passed with the quiet certainty that seasons always return, even after the longest winters. Spring sunlight poured through the maple trees surrounding Ethan's small home on the edge of Chicago, filling the front porch with gentle warmth while birds welcomed another peaceful morning. The little wooden star he and Emily had carved together now rested beside the front door, weathered slightly by wind and rain, yet still standing exactly where they had placed it. Some symbols did not lose their meaning with time. They simply grew deeper. Inside the kitchen, the comforting aroma of fresh pancakes drifted through the house, while laughter floated between the rooms. Emily carefully arranged strawberries into the shape of another star on a plate before looking proudly toward the dining table. "I think breakfast should always look happy," she declared. Ethan smiled as he carried a pitcher of maple syrup from the counter. "I think you might be right." A gentle knock sounded at the front door. Emily hurried across the hardwood floor and opened it without hesitation. Victoria stood on the porch wearing blue jeans, a light sweater, and carrying nothing more valuable than a basket of homemade blueberry muffins. There were no security guards waiting beside luxury vehicles. No photographers watched from across the street. No assistants checked schedules or answered phones. She smiled with quiet confidence, looking more at peace than she had ever appeared inside Sterling Tower. Emily threw her arms around her. "You're just in time." Victoria laughed softly as she hugged the little girl. "I hoped I would be." She stepped inside the modest home that had slowly become the place where she no longer felt the need to prove anything. The walls displayed family photographs instead of awards. Shelves held books worn for being read many times instead of expensive decorations chosen to impress guests. The dining table where they gathered had been built by Ethan's own hands from reclaimed walnut, polished with patience instead of prestige. It was not perfect, but neither were the people sitting around it, and somehow that made it beautiful. After breakfast, they walked into the backyard where wildflowers swayed gently beneath the spring breeze. Emily chased butterflies while Ethan adjusted a small wooden swing he had recently finished building beneath the old oak tree. Victoria watched him tighten the final bolt before stepping back to test its balance. "You still measure everything carefully," she said with a smile. Ethan nodded. "The things people trust deserve extra attention." Victoria looked toward the sky before quietly answering. "That is true for hearts too." Months earlier, she had declined the merger that would have made Sterling Capital even larger. Many people questioned her decision. A few investors left. Others stayed after discovering that a company led with integrity often inspired greater loyalty than one led only by ambition. She remained the chief executive officer, but she no longer allowed the board to decide who she should become outside the office. She had learned that success was strongest when it protected dignity instead of replacing it. As afternoon sunlight settled across the yard, Emily carried 3 small paper stars from the house. She handed one to Ethan, one to Victoria, and kept one for herself. "Remember?" she asked. "Even when we cannot see the stars, they are still there." Victoria looked at the little paper star before reaching for Ethan's hand. This time he did not step away. He gently held hers with the same quiet respect that had first comforted a stranger sitting alone before an empty chair. No grand speeches were needed. No promises sounded louder than the breeze moving through the trees. They had discovered something far more valuable than wealth or recognition. They had found a home built on kindness, second chances, quiet dignity, and the simple courage to choose people before appearances. And in that peaceful moment, surrounded by laughter, fresh spring air, and the family they never expected to become, both of them finally understood that the richest life is never measured by what a person owns, but by the hearts that feel safe enough to call that person home.